Hello everyone, today we trace the essential guidelines for approaching the history of the Roman Imperial Army. So we will be talking chiefly of the Roman army from the, say, 1st century BC, making some, step forward a little bit just for sake of context, to the 6th century, let's say until Justinian times or the time of Maurice, so the very end of the 6th century. And as you understand, it's an extremely ambitious and pretentious endeavor that I decided to get myself in. But I really would like this video to be just not just an introduction, first of all, because it's too concise and it wouldn't, but let's say a sum of tips, of perspectives to effectively approach the topic. And I realize that I'm not talking to a public that is completely new to the topic, that naturally is actually very popular. Let's be honest about it. It's one of those topics in history that everybody has a kind of interest, or at least has heard something about, and kind of things to know and would like to know actually more in this path. So as you know, I'm not an ancient historian. I am a medievalist, but I have this great passion, of course, for the ancient world and ancient warfare, Roman military, etc. And on Schwerpunkt we talk chiefly about the Middle Ages, but we talk also about the Roman army. So I would like to make of this just a set of advice, right? To, at least from my perspective, for what I think is important, for what I think is overlooked. Usually that's also the criterion through which I choose the topics I have in mind, or at least the way I explain them. So I would like to start talking about really. Today we will try to address both tactics and strategy of the Roman military. So we will kind of take a very comprehensive look at the wall. And obviously the first tip in absolute terms is how to read the sources, what sources to read. And it's going to be very simple. I'm going to give you really the essentials. So given that we talk about only the Roman imperial period, right? So the period we have traced, definitely there are several sources we can use that are particularly useful. In terms of tactical treatises, you can look at Onosander, who wrote in the early 1st century AD. He was a Greek historian. Then you can read, obviously, Frontinus, that was actually a governor of Britannia, and wrote a manual that unfortunately now is lost, but supplemented it with another work called the Stratagems, that is this set of let's say a collection of military tricks to play on an unsuspecting enemy. So always bear in mind sometimes the very theoretical approach that these sources have. Unfortunately, we don't have time in explaining it today, but always bear in mind that most of the treatises we have from this era are effectively written by the elites. We don't know much about the perspective, not even, of course, of soldiers, but even of NCOs. Caesar talks profusely about centurions, etc., but it's still the elite, writing essentially for also following certain historiographical and rhetorical cliches sometimes to talk about the famous specula, right? That is what should be the best commander, what should the best commander do, should behave, organize the army in these tactics. But sometimes they're very theoretical, or at least they show us a set of information that is eventually put together for the sake of something else, rather than the actual understanding of how things actually really worked on the field. And that's our major problem with that, because about the ancient world, by the way, we know a very, very few. There's this general idea that we somewhat general prejudice, I would say, we know so much about the Roman army. Sure, we know a lot, fortunately, also because the Romans now expanded into the Mediterranean. They started writing more, they got kind of more a more advanced civilization. They were now also the Greeks writing about them. So we have a lot, but it's still alarmingly few considering all the things we don't know. And in fact, we don't know much to make a fair assessment on the Roman army, on the Roman military. And these treatises are useful because they are the ones who deal specifically with tactics, but sometimes it's also a melange of notions of anecdotes that are drawn from much older history, by the way, because there was this in spite of the cyclical understanding of what the conception of the world and time, etc., there was this idea that there had been a past, an evolution, in, let's say, in military terms. There were certain examples from the past, not just from the same Roman one the Romans wrote about, but also obviously from the Greek one, etc. So there are sometimes even just historiographical works, not these specifically, but you have to understand them in the general trend of those times is historiography, right? So, and then you have definitely Arrian, that was governor of Cappadocia and friend with the Emperor Hadrian, who wrote the tactics. That is paraphrasing the work of Asclepiodotus. That was a very important source, especially for the early Macedonian army, etc. However, the most important work of the author is the order of battle against the Alans. The Alans were this Sarmatian tribe that, while Arrian was governor of this eastern province, came to invade his territory, and he dealt with them militarily speaking, and therefore he explains what kind of orders of march and battle formations he adopted against this people that would, by the way, was basically a horse riding people. Fundamentally, they fought with shock cavalry and horse archers and stuff like that. Then definitely, since we have extended this survey on even also later times, definitely we have to name Vegetius, that is this author that he actually, by his own self-admission, he had no military experience, no first-hand military experience. He wrote during the reign of Valentinian II, Valentinian III, and his work has been very criticized, traditionally, because it's this very, sometimes objectively, yes, some very confused mixture of both current practice of the 4th century and previous methods. Vegetius had this idea of the that also influenced, actually, in a prejudicial way, our view of the thing, historically speaking, that it was the idea of the decline of the efficiency of the Roman army. This was an old cliche that was used actually by several peoples. The Romans also had thought these things at several stages of their history, actually, but he was basically looking upon the armies of time of Caesar, of Augustus, and saying, fundamentally, look at how efficient that those armies practically were, and how now lax and undisciplined they are now. But as a matter of fact, it's in this sense it's very biased, and as far as we know from the rest of all the evidence we have of the Roman army in the 4th century, this judgment is incorrect, is inaccurate. And but we will more of that later, actually, because we'll come to tell some of the differences between the evolution of the Roman army throughout this period. But nevertheless, the contents expressed by Vegetius are very valuable, extremely valuable, and they have obviously to be read with extreme caution and kind of being aware what the author has in mind. But is a much underrated source in by certain standards. At least we have in turn developed like antibodies in form of converse bias towards those contents, thinking that he was kind of theoretical, but he actually says very interesting things, and some of them are really correct. And even in his criticism, there are so many things that he points out that are also very, very correct, as far as we can understand. Towards the end of the period, at the end of the 6th, some think about even the beginning of the 7th century, there is the famous Strategicon, or Strategicon as you want to say it, attributed to the Roman general and eventually emperor Mauritius, or Mauritius as you prefer, and it's considered, an early Byzantine work. Now, and we stopped to it, that I'm not particularly passionate about, considering the difference between the Romans and the Byzantines, which effectively is very controversial at best as a conception. But let's not enter into this place. That is actually it's a big work. It's 12 books, and it offers a great amount of information, tactical methods, of the description of drill movements, also of the lexicon, the vocabulary of the time. Still, at this time, it's written in Greek actually, but you see how still heavy the Latin terms, Latin commands, especially were the Latin influence was in this stuff, in the military terminology, especially in the Roman army at this time, and definitely this was a treatise that in the Byzantine tradition kind of become more it become imitated, like becomes imitated in the following centuries. Think about the later work of Leo, and in the ancient times it wasn't really like that. Like the Byzantines had a much greater intellectual taste for this general conceptions of their military, the effectiveness of the Roman army. They had managed to effectively combine the pragmatism of the Latins, of the initial Romans, with the Hellenic intellectual speculation. So this form represents an incredibly valuable and enjoyable work that provides so many interesting details, and definitely it doesn't stop here, because these are not just the only works that we can use for understanding Roman tactics and organization, but obviously we can make, even talking about imperial times, Caesar commentaries are very, very useful, because it's not that the Roman army changed a big deal in the essentials into imperial times from later republican ones. Plutarch's Lives are also another necessary read, and then Tacitus, or Tacitus probably, as it was, he was more properly called, his histories, the Annals, Agricola and Germania, right? Or Germania if you prefer. Then definitely Flavius Josephus, the Jewish War. It's another very important work. There are this set of histories from Appian, Herodian, Cassius Dios, Suetonius, Ammianus Marcellinus, Zosimus, and Procopius. There's the Vitae Augustae, or Vitae Augustae actually, Julian's Orations, and then the others we've named, of course, with Frontinus, Onisander, and Vegetius, that have always to be considered in this sense. And talking about the translations, so these are works written either in Latin or in Greek, and it's naturally not everyone knows these languages, not have studied it, learned them at school, not even at university. In my opinion, there is a dramatic lack of education in this linguistic fields, and my suggestion is that it's if you want to study ancient history, at least at university, there's no way you can do without a knowledge of Latin and Greek, which doesn't mean just to think to know it, or to find words in the vocabulary and trying to figure out what it means. It takes years to study them, to learn them, and I'm speaking it myself, that I have studied actually Latin for 8 years, but not ancient Greek. So sometimes I have difficulties, etc. The best thing you with Greek, although I've read also quite a thing, a certain amount of stuff also from ancient Greek sources, and I understand something objectively, but I still realize I need more, way more. So if you really can't, take lessons or get into it, the learning of these languages seriously, my advice is obviously to look at good translations, of course, but always bear in mind that they can't be literal. There is all a school of philosophy that says, okay, you can't basically translate literally a text into another thing. Of course, the general understanding, it can be properly formulated, but even some of the best allegedly best translation, like the Loeb one, that is particularly used has been at least particularly used in the Anglo-Saxon world, has caused some of the greatest disasters into even the understanding of military history. We're talking about at very high levels, like with Connolly when he translated from the Loeb vocabulary a long that was basically a heavy javelin of the Carthaginian infantry into sarissa, that is transforming essentially the Carthaginian, the Libo-Phoenician infantries into kind of Macedonian phalanxes. Literally, this is how it happened, and all the other scholars followed, and it's full. There's loads of people out there that believe that the Carthaginians actually used the Macedonian phalanx because of those things. You can see that even in artistical representation, all on the base of this mistake, and not even understanding something so banal that every person who has a decent understanding even of ancient Greek, even classical sources, can figure out by himself. So without even being a specialist. So always stay sharp. Never trust any translation. Doesn't matter how influent it is, how renowned or quoted. It doesn't mean anything, and experience proved it. So you can definitely couple that with what I said before. That is to take up vocabulary of ancient Greek or Latin, or whichever language you want to translate, and read the phrase, try to understand something by that, and check especially the substantives if you're capable. They're kind of easy to follow, and try to get used at least to the semantic shade that certain words at the time had. And always bear in mind that there is nothing categorical in that language. There's nothing scientific in that language. This idea that a word has a single meaning that is that one is defined, you can find it on a dictionary, is something that is born in the Enlightenment. So this is not valid just for ancient history, but for all history up to that point. Is always know that the single terms are extremely fluid. They're used with various different semantic shades, and try in this sense to compare that term from other quotes, from the way it's used in other quotes, right? So and trying to understand how malleable sometimes it can be. And I can assure you that even in fact, there's like Polybius or and that use in other, but of all ages actually at this point, at least in the centuries we're taking into consideration, used a single term in a very unspecific way, right? And it was meant to be so even at the time. So, for example, there is the vexata question of the Roman cohorts during the Spanish campaign of Scipio, and that is pretty interesting, because if you look at the term, it's just like one term used by Polybius once that defines these units, Roman units, semia, that were basically and literally at that point, from an etymological point of view, troops will proceed under the same standard. And there is no other further specificity, and that is stating, of course, that was a put together of all the maniples, of three maniples. I don't remember what it was actually, the three maniples of the triplex Accius, but from there, and that's the only source that from the 2nd century BC tells that. And how do you interpret that with lack of any other evidence of any other author, with the absolute desert or almost in this ancient in these classical sources, because that's how it is. We don't have we don't have the way to deepen those informations. So translations can be very tricky, but if you get used to this mindset, it's going to be much easier for you. And of course, even learning these ancient languages is not excessively difficult, and give it a shot at least. They're not very complex languages in themselves, and therefore there's also a set of advice you can take at this point. That is, don't trust anyone. I mean, literally anyone. Don't trust the sources. Don't trust the scholars. Do not trust the translations, as we've seen. Don't trust me, of course. Don't stay always open to any possible hypothesis and evaluate independently as much as you can, right? So that and especially in terms of the scholars, of modern authors, always check his original sources, whichever he's going to say, because especially for the ancient world, this is extremely easy to do. When you want to even find out where a modern author found information about a certain medieval topic, where that gets much more complicated, because actually there is even first of all, ancient sources are a very few, right? So and then they're very famous, kind of. So they're all published. They're all out there. They're open source. You don't have to do many research. So what you think it's actually, the fruit of such a deep, thorough knowledge and wisdom, etc. Just know that most of the times it actually comes from just a tiny line of an ancient author that is extremely easy, and that basically most of the times it's the only author that gives you that information in that particular context, and that therefore it's nothing that you can't do by yourself in terms of checking the sources of modern scholars. For ancient history, it's that easy, and that's also frustrating, because at one point you realize that it's like you can't go again through the wall, right? We simply don't have sources, we don't have evidence, we don't have information aside from those few ones. Obviously, things get way more complicated if you get into interdisciplinary fields, and obviously also with archaeology. But even in there, the whole picture remains pretty much, foggy, and it's all about conjectures, and it seems that the hard evidence always escapes any kind of and that's why it's so important to get your mind around these concepts, because most of the debates that emerge, these historiographical opinions, etc., emerge from ways people have seen the sources, rather what the sources are. And sometimes these opinions form because of one author even dismissed an information because it said, "Oh, this is just stupid, it doesn't fit," and then maybe someone comes up with an idea and says, "Look, but why? Maybe contextualizing this statement, this information, we can still grasp something else, or maybe it turns out it's not so strange." So, to make the long story short, everybody seems to have an opinion on these topics, including me, for making now so many videos about it. But when we talk about the Roman army specifically, as most of the ancient history, actually there is no way you get to spot things that nobody has never spotted before. Basically everything we are debating still are things that are known from centuries, and where historians are basically saying the same. They're revolving at least around the same sources. Then, of course, the historiographical thought refines, and etc. If you're interested in kind of modern authors about the Roman army, especially also the late one, read Elton, Nicaise, Petit-Jean. These are great scholars that go thoroughly into the source and provide some of the best level of refinement of the evidence. We have to provide some conclusions, and the only field that is capable of expanding this now is archaeology. At least it's the one. There is much also from interdisciplinary approaches that are definitely useful, but still you need the evidence, you need sources. We're talking about history, not speculation. And another advice is you should, in order to understand something about the Roman army, you can't reason like, now I will learn, and this is valid for every single topic, arguably, in history, but even in military history, for every kind of army and military that's been out there. Never think that you can learn military history by studying just one army, one nation, one people. It's useless. Do something else, or at least start from one, but get ready to get into others. So if you want to understand Roman warfare, you should be acquainted with many other with military history in general, hopefully with ancient history, especially ancient warfare, and military history in general, I believe, because otherwise it's really useful even to take this into consideration, because otherwise what happens is that you think that you can't stay in your shell because maybe you like this topic particularly, or you think it's the only worthy thing to know from those times, or you're too lazy for doing something else, and as a result you will crystallize on certain dimensions that will make you lose the point of the whole thing in general. As von Clausewitz says, do not concentrate yourself too much into the details and speculate on them, because it's harmful. Once you look at them, just remember that they are details, right? More or less important as that can be, it's way more important for you to have, in order to understand about Roman warfare, to have an actual grasp about military history in general than just that thing about the Roman army. Right? And this is valid for any other people. I don't understand what people get so sectaries when it comes to, simply because most of the interests are dictated by other nationalistic reasons. Like, I like my team, I have to wave his flag, and that's it. And it happens all the time, actually. So especially in popular culture. So go beyond this, because if you don't go beyond it, you remain where you are, and at the end of the day you don't even render a good service to your team, because you basically build a picture in your mind that is completely unbalanced, because it has no context, right? And it's not able to draw the differences. And that I remember I was talking to even some alleged military experts who are famous out there on the internet, etc., for sharing all this stuff, etc. But on military history, even military men said that sometimes you ask them certain questions to realize, what's the greatest army in history? The Roman army. It doesn't the most effective one, like the one that obtained more results in terms of ratios, and in number, in quantity, that had, let's say, the greatest edge over the others. You say, the Roman army. If you give an answer like this, it's because you know nothing about military history, and I am saying this by loving the Romans. So I have in this, I hope at least, a very objective approach to the matter. I don't judge the Romans as like the coolest thing ever happened in the world, because simply there is no coolest thing happened in the world. There is just an incredibly complex set of things that they are hard even to understand in their essentials in the first place. And if you concentrate on something just because you think it's cool or better, or you load it with all the meanings that you feel because of an emotional reasons, etc., you can't make history proper. These are particularly important advice, in my opinion. So everything I will be saying today is also already being debated. You will find out there people who believe one thing or the other. The things I've learned them firstly through a bit of a broader perspective of military history. As I was saying before, I'm not an expert on Roman history myself, but I think I approached the story with the due attention to certain elements that I will try now to make extremely concise, because these are huge topics after all. Even if if the evidence is so few, still there are really lots of factors, of elements to take into consideration, historiographically speaking. So last big advice in terms of this kind of methodological point is always read scholars. Don't dismiss them just thinking they're stupid. Actually, most of the times, if those are scholars and you are not, most of the times it tends to happen that they seem to know a bit more than you do. So you still have something to learn, and if you read the experts, surely you can catch up with them with the historical awareness that we have historiographically more quickly, and avoiding and trying to get acquainted to at least to the problems that make you understand the limits, more than giving you the actual information and the hard facts, and they teach you to doubt, they teach you to be critical, and therefore to be autonomously capable to read stuff on your own, and to understand it. So excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So now I will be speaking in brutal synthesis about all these big chapters that we will analyze individually and way more in detail. Some of them we have already discussed actually on Schwerpunkt. If you're interested in my Roman warfare playlist, you will find now a pretty large amount of videos at this point, and I will keep making them, hopefully, at least. Talking about the Roman legion, right? So the backbone of the Roman army throughout this rather varied history is the legion, legio in classical Latin, or legio in the let's say the ecclesiastical one. This was a large body of some thousand drilled infantry, mainly, at least, and that were chiefly, at this point in history, trained almost entirely, and especially at the beginning of the period, for close combat, right? Towards the late Roman Empire, there is a greater, let's say, degree of specialization, but at the same time also of an increase in training, in the capability of using several weapons, especially for what it took for the professional army, from the mobile army, that actually make evolve this kind of monolithic heavy infantry, gladius and pilum dimension, but unit, but they still have to be framed into the whole picture, and we'll see now properly why. So the ancient world was definitely not new to these thickly packed formations of infantrymen. If you take the Greeks, or the Carthaginians, the Macedonians, basically they all fought in this kind of orderly ranks. The infantry this time in Mediterranean and in Europe is basically has the upper hand over cavalry. The thing will change very slowly, and it will take way more time than we think. Actually, there is this old prejudice that cavalry somewhat became more important towards the late Roman Empire than infantry itself. It's absolutely false. It's probably not been so. By the way, it's chiefly in the 6th century that, and for certain particular organizational reasons, that cavalry starts assuming, especially in the Roman army proper, not really a decisive role, but at least a leading one, in some ways, and this is also kind of difficult to approach now without going into further detail, but we will be talking about this. I made some videos about Byzantine cavalry of that time. You can go look at that if you're interested. The Roman legionary infantry differed somewhat, however, in the equipment of because it was not equipped with spears or longer pikes, like these other populations had done at this very point, actually. But they used basically this heavy javelin and swords. Right, so initially the same Romans had been equipped similarly like that. I mean, the Italic warriors fought fundamentally like all the other warriors out there. The only difference there is that is always important to trace is that the most advanced civilizations, actually the urbanized ones, the fully sedentarized ones, like the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Macedonians, had developed now this kind of spear formations, right, into which other weapons were kind of less importance, especially in the case of the Greeks proper of Hellenic classical warfare. Then things got more specialized in Hellenistic times, but still these large bodies of infantry were mostly about spearmen. Even the Carthaginians that had this more, especially in their Libov Phoenician troops, the famous long K we were telling before, it was essentially a javelin. It was used both as a spear as a javelin, resemble more the rest of the world. But in fact, the rest of the world was a largely tribal one, fought in not an essentially different way in terms of equipment, at least, than the Roman legionnaire. Meaning what? Meaning that the average warrior out there was equipped with a javelin, with javelins, with a shield and with a sword. So exactly, more or less, what the Roman legionnaire would become. Even if you look at the equipment proper, it's chiefly towards the late Republic and the early Empire that the Roman legionary infantry becomes properly, and debatably, depending on which standards you want to take, but definitely to the rest of the tribal world, really heavy infantry. The Roman army before in the Middle Republic, before the professionalization, is kind of light. It's like medium infantry, right? And it's obviously segmented, as we know. The triplex Achaeus is based on this now fully actually sensual repartition, for which the Astali are kind of light infantry, the Principes are medium, and the Triari are heavy in looking at themselves into the wall. But towards the late Republic and with the Marian Reform, especially, this differences basically are torn apart, and the average legionnaire is shaped around the figure of the Princeps. So a soldier equipped with the gladius, the scutum, the pilum, but also the coat of mail, the so-called lorica hamata in this time, and a helmet, an iron helmet. This is kind of heavier than the average warrior out there, because the average warrior normally doesn't have at least an armor, or at least this is very elite, and the Roman army this time is able to provide the means, the money, the resources to fill this uniformly armored troops, whereas in the tribal world, the armored troops were mainly about the elite. The rest, there was then a kind of a more or less cohesive and homogeneous part of of medium warriors that normally were not armored. They had kind of a helmet if they were lucky, etc., and a sword, etc. And then the big mass of the levies that were fundamentally spearmen, with just like a spear and a shield and nothing else. So the Roman army, in this sense, puts into the as a standardized trooper in the legion, nothing but the figure of a warrior that, in terms of equipment, that, however, has now been given what you don't find in the tribal world, that is an incredibly violent discipline. that is enforced actually with enormous violence. The Roman army and recruitment and training was an extremely brutal experience that basically, in comparison of which, basically a battle was nothing but just like the training, right? And it took for the Romans, and this is not like for the imperial part, because now things had gotten more or less standardized in this sense, but for the Romans it took centuries to transform the mindset of the Italic warrior into something of like the one of a professional, a disciplined soldier. But there is something that remained into the legionnaire, that was the individualism. The Roman legionnaire, albeit trained to fight in formation, was also trained to fight alone in single combat. That was not a best option, but it still worked like that. And it was extremely individualistic minded, at least, I mean, not extremely, but it had still this tendency that can be observed even in his own equipment, that it was not at all the one of the static phalanx, of the guy who just had to maintain the formation, but had this kind of impetus and aggressiveness in their mind. And actually this tends to stop over time. It's very complicated it's not really complicated, but it's complex to explain. Fundamentally, Rome keeps filling the ranks of his legions with troops that were at this point not fully Romanized, that they had maybe fought into the auxiliaries, and then now the next generations, their sons could enter the Roman legion. So kind of committing troops that came from kind of a tribal background. Towards the late Roman Empire, where the provinces are basically or kind of Romanized and civilized, and say in a very propagandistic term, what you have is that the Romans start lacking this kind of individualistic warrior attitude, and therefore they kind of rationalize the way they organize their troops, and they invest much more not on the individualism and of the aggressiveness of the single trooper, but on the combined arms tactics, and this will give actually great results. It's very, now I'm approximating, I'm simplifying, but this really happened over this, we're talking now about 600, 700 years even, so you understand what the kind of modifications that happened. This is not to say that the Roman legionnaire was a warrior. In his mind, he was a soldier. The Romans had made it to transform their human material from warriors into soldiers, but still there was this tension that you can find, however, also in other kind of disciplined armies of the ancient world, but that in the Roman case probably had contributed even to their kind of effectiveness. And you can spot this even in tactics in the same equipment, because the Roman equipment is the one of a warrior, it's not the one of someone who stays there, just holds a pike and just has to have guts and cold nerves to stay under fire against the enemy and wait that the action takes place chiefly on the flanks with cavalry. The Roman legionnaire is someone who goes out there and sees and goes there to disembowel people in front of his eyes, getting blood spurts in his face constantly and on a regular base, because he's mostly aggressive minded. And this doesn't mean that it's the reason why the Romans made it into, actually the real reason is still the rational part, is the discipline side of the Roman army. But this attitude was functional in part to the material that the human material that the Romans had at the beginning, and that they shaped their military system like. And today we can't talk about Republican times because we set our plan to stick still only to the imperial times, but let's say that the Roman military system was way more original than is often credited. Actually was unique in its kind, let's be honest about it, and the idea that the Romans somewhat copied everything from the others is an ill conception. I believe doesn't take into consideration what properly the development of the Roman army was, especially at its origins. I'm extremely jealous about my interpretation of how the Roman army was actually born, and we'll have to explain it more clearly ahead. Sometimes I already made it, but it has to be, and that's why if it effectively managed to take over the most advanced military of the time, that was the ones of the Carthaginians, of the other Hellenistic empires, and why they managed to conquer what was basically the known world at the time. There are other broader political and social reasons for this. It's not just about the tactical effectiveness of the legion, but there were also many other important factors. However, the basic tactics was to throw for the Roman units, to legionary unit to throw their pilum, and that was an extremely effective weapon that also in here had nothing conceptually new. It was just developed by the Romans to assume much more effective performances, and that eventually rendered it capable of penetrating armor, sometimes of sticking in it and encumbering the opponent's shields and all this stuff, and then to pass at close range with these swords with the gladius. Actually, they's often credited to be like not much longer than a stock or something, but especially in the early days, and especially looking at also in the later times when the spada was introduced. I mean, the Roman legionary sword was fairly long, actually, wasn't that, but still it has to be understood in function of the tactics. Many people have a technologistic prejudice that they can't get rid of, for which you win battles because you have the best weapon. It's completely the reverse. Weapons are actually molded by tactics. That is, that weapons are developed by what you have to do on the field, and not the other way around. And that's also why there is a variation of the there's a kind of sinusoidal trend into the evolution of arms and armor in the Roman army, because there were different conditions that changed, and then the weapons and armor adapted to it, and incidentally they were always the best options. So there was never a decline of the Roman army in relative terms. And even if we wanted to talk about it in relative terms, just know that in tactical terms, the formula of the Constantinian army from the 4th century remained for 1 century, 2 centuries, but even beyond, actually superior to the one of the beginning of the century years, because the Vulgata out there is that the Roman army kind of transformed to the needs in the 4th century, but it never quite reached the effectiveness of the first centuries. Well, if you hear someone talking like this, you have someone who effectively doesn't understand much what the Romans did at that point, and how their army really developed like, and what the results were. And this is not a matter of interpretation. It's really that these people still lack of stereotypes, and now have been completely debunked by the most refined historiography out there. There is no historical evidence of any kind that the Roman army somewhat declined throughout all this period. There's nothing like that. In their tactical effectiveness, it's completely false. It's true the opposite. The 4th century Roman army had a much higher aggressive and defensive effectiveness than the one of the Principate and the late Republican times. And if someone tried to make you swallow otherwise, just know that you can't spit it out, because it's completely false. It's completely false. It's completely false. And we will definitely explain why. I don't want to just leave you with this, but you know that we get to cover everything step by step, and I've already addressed this topic at other times. So I don't remember where I was going with this, but the idea is so we just talked about the equipment. More or less, the Roman legionary this time remains equipped with sword, first short, then long, then a helmet, body armor, and a large shield. right? Even forms, shapes, etc. kind of changed. Definitely there is this idea that towards the beginning of the empire, there is the introduction of plate armor, of segmented armor, let's say better, with the that makes kind of the the most famous iconography of the Roman legionary in pop culture, with a square, kind of rectangular shield, etc. But it seems actually that this form of equipment remained not just remained minority and for in terms of time, like it lasted like one century or two, but it effectively was not even in those times, like in the 1st, 2nd century AD, the prevalent armor out there. We don't have any clear and direct evidence of this, but we don't have not even clear and direct evidence of the opposite. And as far as we can see, actually, the two types of equipment always existed. We probably know that we know actually proper that within the same legionary within the same legion proper, the equipment could vary regularly. These troops they were kind of uniformed and standardized for those times possibilities, but still they could effectively customize their equipment in some fashion. There was a functional homogenization, but at the end of the day, even the same methods of production were not really what we think as really standardized, like industrially speaking. These were still very artisanal ways of production, and there was a big deal of room for particular customizations, etc. And even during the same battle, the tactical conditions could simply make you change idea on what to keep yourself like. It's plenty of evidence into Roman sources of Roman legionnaires that having to launch an assault or having to run faster, they simply dismissed their heavier armor. They attacked like even kind of light infantry. So this was part of the Roman tactical flexibility that is often in popular culture, at least, people like to use this term tactical flexibility chiefly to explain what the Romans got over, the Romans took over other, the ancient world and winning over the Macedonian armies, etc. Because it was tactically flexible. What this means is it's rather now. I just digressed on a very thorny topic that is actually my passion. I would like to dedicate like a 4 hours video on, because it's probably but let's say that the problem is that there is too much emphasis put on flexibility when it comes to small units, small unit tactics, right? So as if the equipment formula, the armament of the Roman legionnaire was by itself sufficient, even at kind of a small or even medium unit size, to start winning over other tactical systems. This is very incorrect in many ways. If you look at how the battles were fought at those times, there wasn't that great a difference in the development of the of tactics and effective in the symmetry, let's say that in the asymmetry, that existed between the various armies. Battles were normally won because of entire chunks of the army kind of collapsing for some reason that at that point had nothing to do with the flexibility, but maybe because something had gone wrong in terms of the chain of command, or the terrain was particularly bad, or something got wrong. And actually, even if you look at the confrontation between the famed Macedonian phalanx and Manipular legion in the Middle Republic, you realize that this huge, overwhelming mechanic factor of superiority of the Roman army is not there. is not there. I studied all the battles personally from all the sources of those times, and it's barely a draw in terms of, yeah, at the end the Romans kind of collected more results, but if you look at the context and the developments of every single battle, you realize that it wasn't really because of this enormous flexibility of the Roman army. It's simply that the formula that the Romans had invented happened to be more effective on certain conditions, but the flexibility mostly stayed into the ability of the Roman legionnaire to deploy itself in several different tactical situations, which at that point had not to do with the way battles were fought in small unit tactics, but how battles were kind of prepared. The Roman legionnaire, if you had to make a the most fair assessment or definition about what it was, intrinsically speaking, as a soldier, it was an assault engineer. The Romans didn't win because they had the equipment they had in close combat. The Romans won chiefly because of discipline, training, logistics. An assault engineer is basically a guy who can build you in a few hours a fortified camp under fire in the worst possible imaginable conditions, and obtaining therefore a tactical advantage that can exploit in another way. But if you look at the asymmetry of those times, it was very low. Even if you take some of the most advanced armies like the Roman one, or the most primitive armies like the Germanic ones, you see that the actual difference in potential of these two powers was not enormous. I mean, it was much greater starting from the modern age, and in the majority of conflicts that you spot, than in the ancient world. In the ancient world, differences were very small, tendentially, and that's why battles were mostly won for aspects of the story that have not really to do with how they were fought at the individual soldier level, or even at a centuria level, or at a court level, but how the whole thing was organized, and how because wars, as always in history, even pitched battles, are something very rare eventualities. Wars were won in other ways, and Rome, especially at this point, had a large manpower, resources, enormous monetary wealth, could do really a lot, and field now professional armies, permanent armies, that are normally something that only states can do, and definitely tribes can't. And therefore you can't put the Romans in the basket with all the other great centralized empires in history that deployed this kind of troops. It wasn't different from Han China in the same period. Actually, the Chinese were substantially more advanced than the Romans if you look at their techniques and practices and tactics, etc. But also in here it's relative, because this was not enough. It was not the decisive factor. It was a determining factor, but it's not the decisive one. And that's why the Romans also got their fair amount of defeats, fair share of defeats, that also prove you that most of the times that they were due not to a lack of effectiveness, but actually to either stupid, not even tactical, but just even strategical decisions sometimes, or something like that. And that's why, in fact, most of the times the prejudices about the lack of effectiveness of the late Roman army pop out, because people can't distinguish what is tactical and what is strategical. People see that in the late Roman Empire, at a certain point, armies of barbarians take over. And you say, oh, well, that's might have happened because the Roman army sucked. There is no logical connection between the two things. As long as there was a Roman army standing, it was like the most advanced thing ever out there in around Europe and the Mediterranean. What happened to the late Roman army, especially in the 5th century West Roman half, is not that the Roman military declined in terms of tactical effectiveness. There is, once again, no evidence to back this. The problem was availability of resources, of actual records of means to feed them. That was the problem. It wasn't a problem about the tactical effectiveness. And it is true that definitely even the Germanic populations, these other peoples that had dwelled at the frontiers of the empire for centuries, had got Romanized, they improved their organizational capabilities and tactical effectiveness. They resembled pretty much the Romans. The Romans took also from them, they adapted. Actually, especially if you look in terms of equipment, it was mostly both of them taken from the Celts in part, but even in here, it doesn't mean that one system was, tactically radically different from another, or that there was a decline for explaining that you needed the tactical decline as the reason for explaining why the Roman Empire fell. It's a mechanicistic, technologistic, and wrongly modernistic BS that finds no place in actual historical surveys, and it's alarmingly widespread still at this day, which is frankly unbelievable after all the things that have been written about these topics now. What happened roughly towards into the later centuries is that, as we said, the Roman army invested much more in tactical specialization. This is also probably an optical effect, because what happened is that the Romans stopped having auxiliaries into their within their own borders, right? So what had happened is that at this point they had to integrate those specialties by training the troops by themselves. This is also why the legionary training had de facto increased towards late Roman Empire period, and why this specialization takes place. Many people say, well, but so here the Roman legionnaires stopped to be all armored. This must be a decline. No, it was not a decline, because you can't fight just with armored troops. You need light troops, like the Romans constantly needed throughout all their history. The only difference is that before they took them from the auxiliaries that were people that were foreigners, now conquered by the Romans, that were integrated into separated units of the Roman army. At the end of the empire, this doesn't exist anymore. So either they took mercenaries from across the borders, so people who still had this kind of combative warlike traditions in their pretty alive, because they had not gentrified, it was still tribal and savage, etc. Or or they I don't remember what it was concluding the phrase like, but they simply differentiated within their own army. And if you look at the actual training both of light infantry and heavy infantry of the Roman legions proper in the late Roman Empire, these were way more trained than the ones of the early empire, the late Republic. You can realize that from the complexity of the tactics they were able to perform, that the Roman army of the Principate in the late Republic was absolutely not meant to do. And part of the reason is that definitely the Roman army of the of the 4th century was under much heavier threats than the one of the of the 1st century AD. And so even in here on the concepts on advancements and improvements we will have to discuss a lot, but just consider this not like a passive adaptation to something that brought to a decline objectively in absolute terms. It was the other way around. This was a system that was hardly pressured and therefore developed much more functional means to survive, and it was able to do it. And what happened in the West has nothing to do with the tactical effectiveness. It simply has to do with the collapse of the resources at an environmental and structural level. The East went far, and it went far to maintain actually an incredibly military quality throughout all its existence, basically. So there is no way you can interpret Roman history like that. Today it's considered a farce. It's considered completely, outdated. And the and as we were saying, actually, even in the early times, the legionary infantry had always needed lighter infantry, which could pave its road, because this is how it was. The heavy infantry of the legions was deployed just when there were things like pitched battles, thickly packed formations of enemies that were less trained and less organized, that could be now overrun simply like a steamroller, by a steamroller that the Roman legionary effectively was at that point, or during sieges where the enemies had nowhere to escape, and the heavily armored legionnaire was kind of the best trooper to come across, under enemy fire over the walls into the city, and so on. But when it takes the majority of operations in open field, it's always light troops that actually bear the most of it, and it was like that all the times in Norman history. At this time, there are always more foreigners, always more foreigners than citizens in the Roman army. And it turns out that these fought way more than the Roman legionnaires did, simply because they were expendables, and they were used in that fashion, and that's how the auxiliaries won their citizenry. They obtained it on discharge, and their sons could be, if they wanted, of course, they could join the Roman army as Roman citizens in the legions. So this has always been it. It's always been it. Even at the moment of greatest effectiveness of glory of Rome during the Middle Republic, there were more Italics than Italic allies than Roman citizens there. In times of Augustus, that was the same. It was always like that. And in any case, they participated they bore the heaviest toll in terms of fights and losses, etc. And that's what they were meant to do. We have the Roman military that at this point is pretty big. Actually, if you look at the extension of the empire, it wasn't even such a large thing. Things were done always in every civilization, kind of trying to save money, but still it was an extremely expensive thing. What do? You send out legionary infantry into the most daring and risky operations, like in like skirmishing and other, against in the first line of the. Of course, you send the auxiliaries in. Of course, you send them. And by the way, heavy infantry is not really the best for going through woods, bogs, steep hillsides, etc. You send the auxiliaries in. Those are guys who most of the times actually lived into such environments before the Romans came to conquer their lands. So why using relatively at this point civilized and gentrified legionnaire that has is an excellent professional fighter that theoretically can fight even in those conditions, as we have seen, but that there is no economical convenience to make it fight in those ones. And yet, in fact, the efficiency of the Roman army remained invaried in terms of quality and professionalism. And it seems the moment of least reliance on auxiliary units was the late Republic. Like, by the Middle Republic, fundamentally the Roman army, considering the allies, there was omnipresent and as a complementary force to the citizen armies, had lots of cavalry, light infantry. Take the Velites, for instance. So after the Marian reforms, the Roman army tends for a certain time to rely more heavily just on this mono-arm heavy infantry, right? And to have always auxiliaries, but initially not in this big number. The number, however, increased. It was increased by Augustus. It went on, especially kind of modulating the armed forces for the singular frontiers that were used, and therefore also absorbing other peoples in the process that brought the tactical specialties that were needed to fight on certain scenarios. So the obviously the auxiliaries, there is this idea that the auxiliary was intrinsically either a lighter unit and cheaper unit, and on average it is true, but it's not always true in relative terms. That is, you shouldn't be surprised to think that an auxiliary could wear, for instance, a segmented armor or the same kind of equipment of the Roman legionnaires. There's no evidence in here that tells you, that they were equipped in a different fashion. First of all, it's obvious that the various tactical specialties corresponded to different equipments, first of all. So it's obvious that the heavy infantry that the Roman citizenry could do best, the Roman legionary could do best, was used for what it served to. So you didn't need to add something more than that. Also because in absolute tactical terms, that was still the heaviest thing, the most effective thing you could have. I mean, it couldn't do without lighter troops, but if you were to fight those lighter troops against the heavy ones, it usually, the Roman legionary in its formula could prevail in absolute terms. So this naturally had political reasons. You couldn't create armies of foreigners that were more powerful than the Roman army. That's what happened, in fact, in the later times, where there weren't recruits anymore, and therefore you had necessary to take these barbarians as not into the army actually, but as purely allies. This is also another very important thing to remember, is that the so-called federati weren't part of the Roman army. I mean, if you entered into the Roman army in the late Roman times, you were a Roman legionnaire, and there was a much bigger deal of Romanization of the barbarians than a barbarization of the Romans. And the perfect instrument for achieving the Romanization of these troops was training them into the Roman army and transforming them into Roman soldiers and eventually citizens. And it's always been the case. And it's always been plenty of people who wanted to come back to come into the Roman army to fight for it. And there were advantageous reasons that weren't just about the effectiveness of the Roman army, of course, but they were political, social, economical. You realize that the big empire attracts people who want to work into it, because the big empire has money, and that's what makes it the big empire actually. So the point I was making that I forgot is, however, that there could be troops that were equipped in pretty similar ways, also with similar arms and armor than the Roman legionary infantry. What happened later is that this reliance of the barbarians was not a reliance of the Roman army proper or barbarians, but of the Roman state, of foreign elements that were not part of the empire. That is the real point. So it has nothing to do with the barbarization of the Roman army. The barbarization of the Roman army is a myth. The greatest problems in terms of that have happened like in the first moments in the aftermath of Adrianople, and they were just like, they never surpassed, I think the German records never surpassed like 1/4 of the total army, and eventually they were diluted. So there was never a problem like that. But no, we have to insist to say that the Roman army declined because it went barbaric. It wasn't the one of the early days anymore. As if the Roman army remained kind of it was always the same, or it had been always the same. It's complete nonsense. As we know, in Augustan times there has been this fundamental institutionalization of auxiliary units as permanent bodies of the imperial military that fought alongside the legions. So the tactical, the optical effect of saying, the Roman army kind of grew lighter in the later times, it's because people don't take into account that before it was kind of the same. There had always been lighter elements. Simply they didn't belong to the administrative unit of the legion, but it still fought alongside that. in the late Roman Empire, these were integrated into the legionary organic, and therefore it diluted itself, but in absolute terms it was kind of the same thing. And as we've seen, it was even more effective from a tactical point of view than before. Another optical, let's say, effect is the idea that the Romans had somewhat a few cavalry. Like, you know, if you look at the organic of the Roman military, you say, well, these guys had just a few tens of cavalrymen in a unit, like a few hundreds actually of cavalry units, legions of 5,000 heavy infantry. Yeah, okay, but you don't count in there the auxiliary element, aside from the fact that, as we recall at the beginning, still heavy infantry was, the infantry in general was still more important in the ancient world than cavalry was. So it was more important at least to have more of that. But the Romans still had. And there is also this prejudice that the Romans somehow had kind of poor cavalry, which is very wrong. And it's mostly based, in my opinion, on the fact that, in fact, looking at the organic, like seeing that the Romans had a few Roman cavalry proper, citizen cavalry, also in previous times, but you don't consider that the Romans had lots of allies fighting alongside, and also on horseback. In fact, in Middle Republic, it was just like that. Like the Italic cavalry was like 3 times the Roman citizen one. So and they fought together. So they didn't. And even in terms of quality, the quality of Roman cavalry is kind of weaker. It's a complete myth. Also, this is being spread because some of these myths were spread by the Romans themselves in some indirect ways, at least. But if you study the military history of the Roman time, even Middle Republic, you realize that Roman citizen cavalry never lost a single clash, a single fight, when it was in conditions of numerical parity in that context. So it's in the Middle Republic. So even fighting against very good horsemen and cavalry commanders, like during the Second Punic War against the Numidians, so we realized that this Roman cavalry was way more than just good, actually, and the Romans actually put an enormous care into their cavalry. So as we know, the auxiliary units were distinguished into the cohortes that resembled the cohortal organic within the Roman legion, or in alae, if you prefer, that were the mounted auxiliary units. Then there were the cohortes equitatae or equitate that were substantially a mix, so that there were both cavalrymen and infantrymen, and that's also partly what well, let's not go as far as that, because technically we're talking still about the 3rd century as well, but that gave the idea for eventually even for the vexillationes in part, but we will talk about that in detail on another occasion. Just bear in mind that I'm dramatically approximating for questions of time that we don't have imminently. And as I was saying before, still the Roman legions had, so the citizen troops proper had probably some light troops within the same legions. It means there were some legionnaires who were specialized to carry out certain tactical duties that were different from the one of the normally, from the normal ones that the heavy infantry had to carry out. So there is nothing to be really surprised about. There is an enormous debate on this, even talking about the Antesignani or Antesignani, if you prefer. Who were they? What kind of troops? And part of the debate is because of what we were telling at the beginning. That is that terms are used in kind of quite generic fashion, that generic and unspecific fashion. And the Roman army always had a kind of at least a small body cavalry of its own, right? And most of the cavalry came from other regions. Chiefly, it was made chiefly of Gauls, of Germans, of Spaniards, etc. And Augustus had regularized this auxiliary ally for this purpose. Roman cavalry was actually trained, even at this time, in using several weapons like spears and javelins, but also bows. And we know that even though it wasn't the preferable tactical specialty, it's effectively just the Eastern Roman Empire that is, at the end of the day, able to provide these bodies of horse archers, because it kind of developed in areas where this was a more traditional fighting style. But still, during the Epica, Gymnasia, etc., the Roman cavalry was trained in using all these weapons, and we shouldn't be surprised even if the legionary infantry could use arrows and with bows and slings. This is often overlooked, and we have this necessity, this bias that we need to categorize forcefully without making it fluid. But actually, these were bodies were in continuous evolution, in continuous adaptation to the various scenarios, and they could provide this specialties, let's say, even without a proper hyper specialization in that field. And over time, there was this problem of finding troops that however had this kind of tactical specialties among the auxiliaries, and this was difficult because in the moment in which these troops became auxiliaries, they immediately underwent the process of Romanization, of gentrification, and they partly lost completely at the end their tactical abilities. So Rome kept recruiting people even from outside its kind of frontiers. The Moorish javelin men or the Asiatic horse archers were other very prized skirmishers used into the Roman army. From the 3rd century, there is an increasing importance in cavalry for reasons that have to do more with not necessarily just with strategical reasons, but the idea of having a more mobile army, or at least a more combat-ready army that could move, a more reacting army that could cope with all the various threats that now were happening intermittently everywhere at the frontiers. That was particularly important. So actually armies of cavalry are not necessarily by themselves faster than infantry armies. It really depends what kind of cavalry it is. The Romans definitely didn't have the specialization of mounted combat, let's say, of the peoples of the steppes. They still needed carriages and stuff like that. So even the strategical mobility of these troops has been probably a bit exaggerated, or at least it's been tied to this increasing cavalry, but it's not properly just at a strategical level that this happens. And still the infantry remains the most important arm, right? Even at this period. And naturally the best cavalry could be found chiefly at the eastern borders of the empire. So it ended, the eastern half of the empire tended to acquire this in the late Roman period, this higher and more effective actually amount of mounted troops, and to make a best use of them. Really, the Romans tried. The Romans actually started to recruit this kind of troops. Chiefly on its own. We can say since the very first beginning, right? Since when they went into Asia fundamentally, in the Near East, and they however kind of implemented this, and at a certain point they started copying even the cataphracts, so these fully armored horsemen and horses that however didn't make a great effect. Actually, the Roman cataphract cavalry was pretty ineffective most of the times, and the reasons are several. Now we can't explain them. I made some videos about it, but simply you don't create something just artificial. It's not really the same thing like in the original place where it was developed because of the needs that the specific environment required, right? But it still starts, this heavily armored cavalry starts to appear, at least, and it would have remained even in here with some back and forth into the Roman army, especially eventually the Byzantine tradition. And the Romans, in their technological and advancement in terms of military engineering, for which they were rightfully famous, also made a considerable use of stone throwing and bolt shooting artillery. And this weren't actually something to which the Romans particularly pioneered the development, because these were machineries that existed since Hellenistic times, since the times of Philip II of Macedon, that had started to have the necessary funds to have them. And they're very definitely scenographic anyway. They're portrayed often, but they weren't as important as we think of them outside siege work, right? So this machinery was chiefly thought and developed for that specific siege warfare, right? But sometimes they were also used in open field, right? Especially at the beginning of this period, what is interesting is that, however, in the 4th century, artillery becomes an integral part of the legion, and especially with the Cairo ballistae, that were ballistae mounted on carts that could be developed more effectively. So it kind of they became, naturally these weren't very heavy. They were usually bolt shooting and kind of small dimensions, but there were also some developments in the artillery. And this time, actually, what is often overlooked is that there was a kind of improvement also in here towards the late Roman times of artillery proper, or other kind of throwing and shooting machinery. The people say, well, how? They abandoned actually the torsion system. Yeah, because it was too expensive. And they started inventing other things that worked just the way just fine, and they were cheaper. So why? And even the importance of siege machinery in the early Roman army is kind of very relative. Nevertheless, this artillery could be used also in open field, as we were saying. The ideal was to use it for covering fire during, I don't know, a river fording, or trying to make the enemy dislodge from certain positions. It could be deployed in pitched battles. If the Romans were lucky, they could deploy it on a hilltop, so where they could increase their range and all this stuff and see better the target, etc. There were no war elephants at this time. There was seemingly someone who advocated the necessity of using them towards the end of the 1st century AD, but they basically never appeared in practice, or at least they never were a characteristic element of the Roman army. The Romans made their most extensive use of war elephants during the 2nd and the 1st century BC. And because of the Numidian allies, actually, the Romans fought all the Macedonian wars with the Numidian elephants brought by their allies. But the Romans, I don't think the Romans ever bred war elephants on their own to use. In in some regions camels were used, especially for desert patrolling, which is evident that, and the camels can also scare horses, but it's not that this ever made camels substituting horses, and I think there must be a pretty logical reason for this, but these are just means of movement more than else. And the Roman legion never quite had a specialized engineer unit proper. At least I don't think there is an actual evidence of this, but it's needless to say that the Roman army was definitely full of craftsmen and of other engineers. Also the Roman commanders could undergo this kind of training. There were special units, even the Roman guard were trained about technique and stuff. So there was definitely a personnel into the Roman legion that we don't know excessively well, that however was perfectly able, as we know, to build turf or stone forts, barracks, roads, and wet or dry bridges. And that the Romans were, probably they're pretty renowned for, given their feats in military engineering that are regarded as kind of the most advanced in the ancient world, at least. Also because of the resources that they had available, by the way, as an empire in general. And let's see what else we can say. And in terms of tactics, now this is a very complicated topic because we could make too many approximations. I must definitely make some video on the various formations of the Roman army. But another tip I can give you is never to think we know how these armies really worked. Do you think we know how Roman legions fought, how they were actually deployed? We don't know. And if you find someone who tells you that he knows, just know that it's false. We don't know how much space there was between the units. We don't know how the various units interacted. They're all conjectures. Some are better, some are worse, but you can't even pretend to have a clear picture of such scanty evidence diluted into centuries and centuries of history to pretend to know how it really worked. And as I was saying before, never also mistake the Roman army for something intrinsically different from other armies out there. I mean, it's not that there are, with the technology of the time, so many different tactics you can try. The idea is you mostly these armies fought in very much more similar ways than we really think. Asymmetry is pretty low. So the general tendency was obviously to put this bulk of infantry in the center, roughly, and letting the cavalry operating on the flanks. And generally there was a preference for the right wing in terms of the one that had to carry out the most complex maneuvers, partly because of the shields that were embraced on the left side, so during maneuvers they could be less easily damaged by enemy fire. The other flank, the other wing normally tried to outflank the enemy in the meanwhile, while the enemy was more upset what was happening on its left flank. And much of some of the greatest battles, if you look at Pharsalus for example, or others, are pretty simple. And it's pretty homogeneous throughout all the ancient world. If one of the wings collapsed, basically the enemy wing could simply outflank the formation, and this fell normally. So even if cavalry was not the most important arm, still historically this is how the thing happens, because the army can at that point attack the enemy without any that has necessarily to either turn, and it's caught between two fires fundamentally, because from one side there is the infantry that is fighting, and you have either on the flank or on the rear enemy cavalry attacking, at that point you just throw arms away. This didn't happen just for the Macedonian phalanx, that, you know, as soon as it was surrounded, it gave it way. This was true for the Roman army as well, and that's one of those examples that make you understand how there weren't many differences, really, and you can't say that it was all about this fundamental new tactical and effective system that had been figured out by the Romans that destroyed everyone else, because it wasn't like that. No army in history has ever found the way. There is no way. You have to really work on so many different aspects that are very incidental sometimes, and so pretending that the Roman army was kind of structurally the best thing ever invented that could overwhelm all the armies is a gross misunderstanding of military history in general. Doesn't take into account all the Roman defeats at the hands even of more kind of primitive, less sophisticated military systems. It doesn't take into consideration that this were still, you know, large bodies of thousands of infantry of men that in general were, however, very difficult to maneuver all at once. That especially the largest battles sometimes were, you know, the larger the battle is, and the simpler the plans of battle are, because it increases proportionally the difficulty of managing all this system. So what cavalry did was to this point not just obviously to surround the enemy, to outflank it, or to avoid being the Roman army being outflanked. And in Rome, definitely ancient cavalries charged. Obviously, they didn't charge as heavily or effectively as, you know, later feudal cavalry, but they were pretty. You know, you wouldn't wish to have tested it on yourself, believe me. And that was the task of cavalry throughout all history. There is no other way around this. And these troops were all supported by other kind of lighter troops like skirmishers on foot, archers as well, also mounted archers. And the volleys could be shot either overhead or the enemy ranks to make them over the friendly ranks to make it fall on the rear ranks of the enemy, etc. Artillery, as we've seen, could be also used. The Romans were not the only ones to make use occasionally of field artillery, if it wasn't anything like really field artillery, but still could be used as such. And at this point, the idea was to bottle the enemy into a situation in which he couldn't escape the assault of the bulk of the Roman army that normally had an edge over the enemy, at least was better trained, better equipped, and, you know, better organized, more disciplined, and therefore that was the point, putting the enemy in a cul-de-sac. And at this point, the Roman army, we don't really know how the small unit tactics worked, as we said before, and probably there was much more interaction than we think. The Roman army had pretty effective NCOs. There was a great competition to their ranks, so this makes us suggest that probably small unit tactics were pretty, pretty dynamic as much as it is possible. The battlefields are not basketball fields where you can make all the most sophisticated evolutions just as if, you know, it was something so simple. So that's another reason why there is no superior system that can cope with all the possible eventualities you can find on a field. Most of these battles were fought even among, within, farmed areas, with buildings, with river, with streams. So everything was way more complicated, and there is no pre-arranged formula that can cope with that effectively. And the whole military art revolves around the ingenuity of finding out the right solution at every moment. usually the Roman army, especially in the Middle Republic, did a very effective use of reserves. The whole triplex acies system was conceived in this way. At this point, paradoxically, during imperial times, we lose track of this. We know that, of course, there could be different deployments, but we don't know how they were regularly used, and how often they were used and how effective they were, etc. We just have the point that the cohorts now have become the main tactical unit of the army, and they still worked with some kind of subdivision within it. The manipular system proper was not ended with the Marian reform or the corps, but at that point it depends what the tactical situation requires. Also, on the genesis of the cohort, we will have to talk a lot, because it's still a chapter yet to be written, really, in its even historiographically speaking. I still have to figure it out more precisely, because I have my own opinions, but I'm not sure. Honestly, I still have to explain it better, and just know that all the explanations out there are just conjectures. So you can't, and I can't find that out either. But if you find someone who has found a solution, like, oh, well, no, the cohorts were used simply because, yeah, they were larger and they were to absorb the charges of people's, like, the Teutonus and all this stuff, myths. We don't really know that. We don't really know that. There is no way, no exact way. You don't know how these legions worked. You don't have it. You don't have a clear path of why they evolved in that way. Or at least you can't explain it with such a simplistic reason. And these reasons are overly abused by people who don't even know much else about the Roman army, just these things they read on the internet. And I'm not telling you I'm here to present myself as this great expert, because you realize I'm not, but always distrust, and just focus and try to exercise your logic, but in an intelligent fashion, that is to spend years of your life researching on stuff, not just pretending to read it once and picking the thing that seems to you better sounding and pretending it's correct. The idea was also, as always, to pursue the enemy once it was broken, not with infantry, but the heavy legionary infantry, with light cavalry. So normally the legionnaires would stop in front of the enemy fleeing, and lighter cavalry was launched against the enemy that now couldn't oppose any resistance during the rout. It could be butchered down. Sometimes the Romans were able to trap their enemies to slaughter them, like into places they couldn't escape from, like butchering them down like beasts. And this happens also throughout all military history, but in Roman history there's plenty of these examples as well. You have to think that ancient warfare was plain butchery. Don't think it was anything different than that. There was blood, and especially a lot of blood. And the Roman legionnaire was trained to kill in the sharpest, most effective way, like any professional soldier is meant to be, a perfect killer. There's not much else you have to do on a battlefield. You don't go there picking flowers, but just to massacre your fellow men, and that's what the Roman legionaries were pretty effective at. Let's say also in here, we may go into detail in our stuff, like where the commanders located, how reserves were used, etc. But this is also partly very, very conjectural. In any case, this is something that was done in any other military historical context, so there is no reason to doubt this was somewhat different into the Roman case. it's all easier if you read them like that, because it's also what military logic suggests you. So it's, and the, what else can we say? March formations were also pretty interesting. We have some information about that, as we said before. Naturally, the most effective way was to use scouts in the front, so either cavalry or light troops, and especially it was the auxiliaries who made the best scouts and explorers. So yeah, and the and by the way, every these columns were conceived to be deployed very quickly into battle line formation. Right? How, we don't really know. Partly, it was easier to understand it into the triplex Achies. Here it's a bit more complex, but the idea that is even artillery had to be kept ready for being deployed immediately. So there is this, what you can expect, a great effectiveness and a very high degree of training to perform these maneuvers. That is all what that can really make the difference between a battle won and one lost, really. And you can expect part of this formation, a typical way to do it in history is you wheel this column wheels into one direction 90 degrees, and then when it has turned, then all the troops turn towards the enemy, whichever side it was, and you have the battle line. So as we were saying before, the battle formation could be, it usually was a long line in general. I mean, there were obviously reserves, many, but I think the tendency, even if you look at some of the great battles, we know how troops were deployed. There wasn't this over-reliance on reserves. It really depends on what the situation was, but preferably, especially in open ground, there was this continuous line that the enemy would try to outflank. So the major battles normally work like that. Sometimes you really don't have an option. And now, I don't want to leave you with the idea that Romans deployed just on a single line. Absolutely not. They obviously did in several different ways, even in this time, not just when they abandoned the triplex Achies. So, but there were several combinations. But generally speaking, the tendency is that, especially in open ground, what you try to do is to stretch the line to cover your flanks, because that's really the crucial point. You don't want to be outflanked. So naturally, being deployed with your shoulders to a natural obstacle is very good, as long as it doesn't make you get trapped into somewhere. It can definitely happen. Sometimes it was even searched for that, like not to make troops at least to discourage them to turn away and flee. But yeah, this was the main concern, not being outflanked, as always in every military situation, not just in the Roman context. Talking a bit about maritime warfare, this is also kind of interesting, and it wasn't, naval warfare in antiquity wasn't really that frequent. Like, naval battles were pretty rare. The Romans engaged into them initially against the Carthaginians, then they kind of fought against the pirates in the 1st century BC. Then there are these great battles, like the one of Actium, or Actium if you prefer. Actium properly, not Actium. But there were rare eventualities. Nevertheless, there were some kind of precise tactics that were developed. First of all, the Romans tried at the beginning to bring into their. The Romans weren't. They were kind of sea lobsters. Like they didn't. They weren't much of a maritime people at all. The Romans were mostly a terrestrial-minded people, coming from the Apennines, the Italian peninsula, at least in its. And they didn't have much experience of maritime warfare. So they began to copy their the ships in their essential from in their structures from the Carthaginians, and they proved to be extremely effective into this. They soon managed to build their own fleet and to put it at sea and to train the crews. And their idea was that, was bringing the Carthaginians, bringing their own legionnaires, that were the strength of their army, to fight over the enemy ships. So simply assaulting them, like boarding them, and getting rid of the enemy marines. So every Roman ship at this point had a certain amount of marines that had to fight, aside from the crew that was just to man the ship or its artillery. It was frequently deployed on it. We could see that now about sea maritime warfare. I would like to get into combat proper. Usually, even during battles, that battles were always kind of fought at this point, like navigation all along the coasts. So battles were naval battles were usually a bit more staged. There was this tendency to rely on oars for maneuvers, etc., not much on sails. Sometimes the masts were even taken away before the battle, because they were too heavy and especially this happened because the various maneuvers were to be calibrated by the oarsmen and even by the marines. The marines were trained actually to stand on several parts of the deck to especially during the ramming maneuvers, to give extra strength to the ramming impact, and this was extremely complicated, and it required a lot of training, a lot of timing, and it's something particularly complex to achieve. Rowing was kind of the main tactics of the ancient world, but over time the expansion of size of Roman ships in this period brings to these ships to become larger and to rely chiefly on boarding, and or at least to try to burn the enemy fleets down, either throwing with this artillery, burning like incendiary material for against chiefly the masts or the cordage that at that point could cripple in part at least the ship that, as we've seen, was still able to rely on oars constantly. It was required to do so. And naturally galley warfare now is something complicated, but you can't look at in detail, but it's what this was. The rowers had the time needed to be landed for cooking, water, sleeping. It was tiring to use naval, and that's part of the reason why ships this time the naval warfare wasn't so frequent in absolute terms. And the Romans added to this habitual ramming practice also a new, or at least made boarding becoming dominant, right? This was caused by also the increase in the dimension of the ships, as we said, but also for this need for the Romans to basically brought the enemy to fight as if it was on land, right? By manning, by sending land soldiers, let's say, into the ships to pour them on the enemy's decks and to slaughter them. And the rowers also were engaged in the fight sometimes, at least if reinforcement was necessary, and sometimes it can't really make the difference. There were many other methods, like there were suspensed burning braziers, swung from a pole over the bow, and that were dumped on the enemy deck. There were other practices that kind of sometimes appear into these lists of anecdotes, like baskets full of snakes or scorpions that were thrown against the enemy, but it sounds pretty kind of weird. There was the practice, however, to harpoon and hauling in an enemy vessel with an engine launched weapon. And there was definitely artillery into it, as we remember, but they were mostly either incendiary artillery or like for taking out the enemy personnel from the enemy decks, rather than being pretty heavy machines that could unbalance the ship in itself. Like it could be like ship sinkers. No, there isn't much evidence of that, actually, not at all, I believe. But yeah, of course, some larger machines could be used, especially on the larger vessels. However, the most important invention, the most important contribution to maritime warfare in Roman times was the corvus, the so-called raven. So which was basically a heavy spiked boarding bridge, which the Romans made fall to spike the enemy decks, and discarding and pouring enemy the legionary infantry, let's say the marines, onto any enemy ships. Although this practice could be achieved only in good weather conditions, let's say it was pretty complicated to do this with bad weather, with high sea, with with pretty big waves when all the ships were moving. So even in this, these are all the reasons why maritime warfare was generally avoided. At least it was always preferred to settle the matter on land, because actually even maritime warfare was a resort for preventing enemy troops to be landed on and more than else, so that if you could engage enemy fleets loaded with an enemy army, you could knock that out. That was obviously great, but it was a risky endeavor in general. Also, for all the odds that surrounded the whole amphibious operations as well, this possibility of still relying on the ships was very risky. So that's why it was preferred to do something else, and even to more safely meet the enemy on land rather than on sea. If you at least unless you could rely on kind of some good ships, and in a strategical theater where it was kind of easy to prevent the enemy, because at this point naval technology didn't have from landing. I mean, because at this point naval technology didn't quite allow to make effective blockades, like of dominating the sea, to have a really hegemonic force. Like it's something that will appear only during the Victorian times, where naval technology will allow to really block entire parts of sea for not making enemy ships cross. At this time it was much more complicated and when not impossible, but at the same time the problem was when the fleet now was along the coast. It could still dare to re-embark the troops, etc. And this was maybe this could be a pretty important logistical need for the same armies on land. and that was the main problem, really, not really the engagement in sea, right? At sea, sorry. And sometimes the Romans are also famous for having modified their ships for the sieges of coastal towns. Some could be joined together, some others you could mount heavier artillery, like as a battery in a battery, for example. And some of them could be fitted with some ships could be fitted with special ladders or wooden sheds to provide cover from the missiles and for light artillery pieces. And there are famous famous blockades from sea. If you think about this siege of Syracuse, etc. It's plenty of this evidence, but yet still pretty rare in general, and still we don't know in full detail how it was like. Coming back on land, looking at the Roman use of field fortifications. So the Romans made extensive use of them, and considerable, considering that the Romans were famous for the best field fortifications ever, even best than the Greeks, from which they had originally drawn most of the example. And the Roman army entrenched every night, building a new camp every single night. Sometimes these armies were so big that by the time the head of the column in a day of march was stopping to build the camp for the night, the rear of the column was stopped ending just now to leave the other camp. So you understand, and this was done really even just to keep the men in shape and being organized and know how to build this. It was an exercise, a very tough exercise. Even just remember that the Romans brought with themselves also sometimes all the necessary tools and material needed for building a new camp. There was excuse me, that they had the engineering capabilities to build out of scratch in a few hours. And every soldier knew how this had to be done. It was extremely sophisticated. I even made a video on how however in Republican times, how the Roman camps were practically built. I mean, in the sense how they made it to know what the shape was, what the dimension was, and how to build it from. It's particularly important as well as fascinating. And naturally the camp is also in here. There were a few peoples that made fortified camps proper at this time. I mean, every army had this kind of barracks where to settle this encampments better. Not barracks, but encampments proper, but only kind of the Mediterranean civilizations now had this. They were so ahead that they could achieve this level of fortification, organization, etc. in such a few time. Chiefly because they were statal entities that had the resources to even provide the men with the training and to do that and on a regular base, like professional and permanent armies, right? And camps were there to stay. Obviously, during battles, the camp normally obviously is behind the enemy army, and it's in there to guard the baggage, and also to provide a refuge. The case you're defeated by the enemy and you want to have a safe place to retreat into. And not that at that point usually there was a much greater resistance. Usually when battles were lost, camps were also abandoned, pillaged by the enemy, etc. So, but simply because there was no resistance achievable, continuable, etc. And what is very interesting is that every Roman camp has a standard layout that kind of evolved over time, actually. But the Romans knew perfectly how to make this in a perfectly geometrical fashion. They knew how to take all the measures, the distances, and to make it in a very brief time, sometimes even under fire in very dangerous situations. And normally some of the troops were deployed around the perimeter while the other troops were to defend. The other troops were working at the camp, and they were normally rectangular. The camps were normally rectangular, were usually rounded corners. They had a ditch with the soil cast up behind to make a bank. On the top of which the soldier, each Roman legionnaire actually planted his own stake he carried. These stakes were known as the pila muralia, which means actually the wall's pilum, right? So, and the name pilum is, you realize also in here, it's a good example that the pilum is the heavy javelin of the Roman army. This pila were something very different. They were sort of stakes. They were pointed at each end, and they were narrow at the waist, so that they could be lashed together, and so you can have this sort of Frisian horse of it. And there are many hypotheses on how they were actually mounted. Some think that they were lashed together, but inserted into the top of the bank of dirt that surrounded the enemy camp, so that basically there was a spike pointing over towards the sky, like a palisade in the front, and then part of the other stake inserted in a perpendicular way into the bank with the spike pointing out over the ditch, right? So that this would have made it was just an hypothesis, but it's kind of fascinating. So to prevent the enemy to assault it effectively, at least to provide a further obstacle, right? And these pila were pretty heavy. Sometimes, and so they have nothing to do with the javelins. I've read somewhere that the information that the Roman legionnaires carried 2 pila was basically telling that one of them was the stakes, but it's actually false. The Roman legionnaire carried 2 pila because one was used for being launched at a certain distance before the charge, and another one right afterwards. So they were actually different in size, yes, but they were effectively javelins. This pila muralia were only stakes. So you realize how the term pilum is flexible. Pilum means basically a stake, a point, a stake, whatever it is. So it's something pointy, something, and those are not definitely the pilum is not the same thing as the pilum muralium. So and sometimes, however, this pila muralia were used also as, they could be used as missiles. It's possible. I mean, being something pointy that you could even break in order to, it could be thrown literally at the enemy, like everything else basically. But they were not designed for it actually. So and that's not really, that's a desperate thing you want to do. Those are chiefly to fortify the camp, right? And the gateways of the marching, these were marching camps. The Romans had different types of camps, but also the larger ones were the permanent ones were usually developed from these marching ones, and even many Europeans, even many cities around Europe and the Mediterranean were born out of Roman camps that were settled at one point, and eventually they remained there. The legion had its barracks built upon them and then fortified, and eventually it remained a settlement, right? So the gateways were usually protected by an angled protrusion or a detached section of ditch, which made it necessary for attackers to make a double turn, right? So this could expose their flanks to missiles and broke their impetus. This obviously is not really a standard characteristic, but it was as well used. As we know, the gateways were connected by these two broad streets, the Cardo and the Decumanus, that were also into the plans of the cities of Roman foundation, and the various tents, usually leather or other material, were all within it. Once again, if you go into the video on the Roman camp I made, that's clear. It makes it clearer. And the ramparts and ditches could be leveled when troops moved on, but it usually was preferred to leave them like that. And some of them are still to be obvious today, actually. And other more permanent forts were kind of similar to the marching camps, but could be even smaller usually, because actually the legion were pretty big. So other forts could be usually smaller, depending on which kind of unit had to host. And at this point, however, ditches could be much deeper. So it was a much greater work on the building, and such ditches could be even double or triple depending on. Ramparts were taller and often constructed of turf blocks, and they were usually topped with a wooden palisade and wooden towers. Improved the defenses at the corners and the gateways usually. And at this point, tents became kind of wooden buildings, more like barracks. And also this form of fortification is not very different actually from other ones, historically speaking. Like if you look at medieval fortifications, they used them in the same exact way. So certain things really never change in times where technology substantially doesn't change, and the problems that are posed, tactically speaking, are always kind of the same. The idea, even when the Romans had a camp, was to still fight outside of it unless the enemy was not overwhelming in number, because the idea was that Roman troops were kind of better deployed in their, outside, right? But still, because they could perform their own tactics more effectively, and we know the Romans could do that. Yet, still, the fort has this intrinsic, strength as a position that is also not to be overlooked. The Romans made extensive use of field fortifications against enemies that were, pretty also fearful, like in combat and in charges, etc. So they could effectively break their impetus with these fortifications, etc. But usually, still, the Romans counted on their ability to defeat them in open field, or at least with some cover, even from maybe deploying just outside the fortifications, being supported by the men of the ramparts and so on. So some of these fortifications eventually were even rebuilt in stone, right? And therefore were always shaped in a fashion that could favor the mobility of the troops within the same encampment. They weren't conceived as just, a container. They had to allow the troops that were inside of it to make a very rapid deployment. and to get out pretty quickly, by the way, not to get congested into the various narrow inner paths, etc. Also, cities and towns and other settlements were surrounded by this kind of defenses, and the most important centers were surrounded by strong stone curtain walls with fortified gateways and having projecting towers and ditches, and this was pretty uniform all over the empire. So we have still much evidence of this. Some of these structures were eventually maintained as fortifications into the Middle Ages. Sometimes actually even some non-military building was so well solid and well built that it was used as a fortification during the Middle Ages. Think about the Colosseum, for example. And some cities had even several concentric rings of defense, so they could be defenses, so they could even conceive this idea of, not very differently from the medieval world either, that even if the enemy took one side of the walls, there were other walls within, and it's pretty interesting because basically you have, several barriers that are sometimes even difficult to spot from the outside if you're not from an elevated position. And the defensive artillery was usually concentrated in the towers, and originally, that there's all this problem of the limes that we discussed. It's the idea that the limes was, the Romans didn't quite have a border in the sense we intended today. There was definitely a kind of a boundary of where was the Roman directly controlled territory or not. But usually the Romans tended to, at least at the beginning, to have a sort of barrier that was far from the most important city centers, and that was made up of a series of forts that they weren't much different in concept from the ones of the late Empire. But what happened is that in the late Empire, this maintaining this cord of defense, it's kind of becoming too demanding. So it was better to withdraw and to use actually the biggest cities as fortified centers, as way more imposing ones. So there was a shift, let's say, into the late Empire for the deployment of the troops from this outside forts into the cities, so that the troops were usually built on the city householders. Also in peacetime, by the way, so that they, rather than on force on their own, it costed and had to be maintained, and even at the end of the day could be overrun, especially by the larger invasions. Although the system still worked, the famous system in depth, there were other forts scattered. They simply there was however a more profitable reliance on the biggest cities, especially against larger enemies, especially these confederations that became increasingly more aggressive over time. And in fact, because originally these forts were maybe even close to the city, but outside of it. So sometimes they evolved into cities themselves, but other times they were now abandoned and the troops were deployed within the same city, right? And the military presence was important because some Roman camps were actually self-sufficient. They had baths, they had all the necessary for living peacefully in peacetime, because actually most of the time the Roman Empire was in peace. There were minor, maybe skirmishes along the frontier, incursions, etc., but there weren't any, for centuries certain provinces remained relatively, peaceful. So and this animated even the local life, like with parades and games and training stuff, that the same army, even for keeping itself trained, staged, like for maintaining troops fit, etc. And at the beginning of this period, let's say at the end of the Republic, Rome basically, the Senate basically sent some a representative of Rome to intervene into the affairs of some foreign state. Always trying. Rome was like the next door bully that over every certain time wanted to enter your homes, is starting to seize much more power, etc. And sometimes it was the case that this local and powers existed, and therefore Rome decided that her honor had been impugned, and some wars could be fought. It's not really that after the defeat of the Macedonians and the Seleucids, Rome had to deal with some major threats, like there were the Germanic migrations, the Cimbrian or Cimbrian, Teutonus, etc. But that it was still not like a omnipresent threat that was like a it could materialize as well as it was effectively wiped out at the end. And other states would simply lay arms down, or at least say, okay, we will fight in the service of Rome, and therefore Rome would nominate and support a native ruler, and these states would work as clients for Rome. And it was not an easy time, because these client kings were constantly being controlled by Rome, etc. The idea is that Rome always sought at the end of the day to incorporate directly these lands, and this could happen sometimes through a relatively peaceful process of Romanization, like simply with commercial penetration and progressive cultural homogenization of the rest of the empire. So, and that happened through civil activities, but still Rome could, at one point make a coup and take power, so it was pretty normal. And some peaceful acquisitions sometimes hide, real extortions from the side of the Romans towards these minor powers. And the Romans also, in order to control the client states, didn't really, a great advantage of the client state was to make them defend in their own land by themselves, right? And so that Rome didn't have to deploy troops in there. So a problem eventually when these states were incorporated is also that Rome had to spend troops to protect more, let's say, a greater frontier. At the same time, there was no need to keep soldiers in there, usually, but just some legions pretty close so that they could intervene in case things. So Rome, as we know, acted on the basis of deterrence. They didn't need even to intervene, but it was enough to see a Roman legions arriving for everybody to be rather condescending towards Rome. And the main difference that occurred on a strategical level in later times is that the statal control intensified on the territory. The Roman state became more centralized, also in terms of military administration, etc. And part of this reason had been, the problems that had also occurred in terms of the rather decentralized system of government that had happened, that had been set at the end of this time, with certain imperial control provinces, some senatorial control province. Now emperors wanted to really control everything, and the client kings were gradually absorbed, and the borders were stopped now on defined boundaries, and like major rivers or mountain chains, or even with some permanent fortification, ditches and palisades, of chains, of posts. And the initially, as we know, there were these garrisons along the frontier that eventually, and the legions were scattered there. The problem is the legions had begun in part to rebel for political reasons, to support the rise of an emperor, the overthrow of another. So the emperors at one point had decided to rely on mobile armies rather that could go individually with them, rather than having undetached troops, so that aside from the frontier troops, basically the majority of the hinterland was devoid of a real army, of the legions that previously had been stationed in here. So towards the end of the towards late empire, let's say, this system was kind of partially absorbed by having this relatively smaller but more efficient and more loyal armies at the service of the emperor, a safe capital. Also, the centers of the empire were gradually shifted towards the Mediterranean lands because the frontiers had become less secure, and everything was more directly controlled. Even armory production, that before was rather autonomous and based even sometimes on the legionary production, and then eventually increased controlled, managed by the state, so that even weapons costed a lot. So even arming a population, obviously the Romans tended to keep everybody disarmed if they could. So just the military had this honor, let's say, and that was wise, especially in a world like that where the state was pretty light, and therefore if you even allowed people to be armed, they could have found so many rebellions, etc. And as we were saying before, during the 3rd century there is even this progressive splitting of the original legions into these vexillationes that weren't actually anything new. With the vexillationes appear very early in time, a couple of centuries, even more before that. But at this point they start becoming kind of more frequent, because at one point the emperors want more troops to arrive more quickly in one place, not fully subtracting troops from a particular sector, but still getting kind of the best and more mobile troops to shift along the borders and to become kind of more handy. And the general trend was the centralization of the field army and the progressive differentiation of it with border garrisons, from the border garrisons that were growing. Actually, they weren't really bad troops. The idea that the Limitanei troops, different from the Comitatenses, one were somewhat weaker, but it's not really true. I mean, obviously the mobile army was usually containing the very elite as well, but the quality of the troops, even their equipment, wasn't much very different actually. And even the Limitanei troops, the border garrisons, had their own pretty solid military activity and military organization, because initially they were just stationed there as bodies of troops without any particular tie to the place, and eventually they started living in there and fortifying there and fighting for defending those same places, and they had resources, etc. So they were not really bad as one thinks about it, and the differentiation is too light sometimes to really make this sharp distinctions. And this prevented, as we were saying, rebellions to break out more frequently, at least. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Because the various armies were now concentrated usually into the emperor's hands, at least the mobile ones. The others were kind of either more scattered, or however they didn't they weren't associated to a new center of power. Naturally, as we know, the empire got finally divided in these two halves, so that at that point you have two different empires, and in spite of all the general enmity and distrust, these two halves kind of cooperated pretty usually, I would say. There were rare events in which they did excessively nasty things one against the other. Obviously, part of the reason why the western half fell is also that the eastern part kind of sent part of the most troublesome federati into the west, but to deal with them, and this part effectively saved the eastern half, because things could have gone otherwise even there. But the eastern half proved to be wealthier, better organized, and generally it's really a matter of resources. It's not really even a matter of strategic formula, or, as we were saying before, tactical quality. That there wasn't this great difference. It was just about this great macroscopical, I would say, relations of power that were very much based on the demographics sometimes, and grain supplies, for which, if you didn't have even the manpower to recruit an army, so you can't even evaluate the army that way. And it's a statal problem, it's a political problem, social problem, not really a military one as a cause, right? And as we know, the Western Empire effectively came to basically to vanish. It wasn't even properly disintegrated in itself. It was simply disappeared in the 5th century, even by name, because there were even there 476 certain nuclei of power of Roman administration surviving, like in Pannonia, in Gaul, or even in North Africa. But still the situation was very, very different, and as we know, the eastern half now reunited all the imperial eagles that were sent back by Odoacer from the west, and therefore it becomes properly the Roman Empire once again. It's the Eastern Roman Empire, like administratively speaking, as long as there is a Western Roman Empire. Then it comes to be just once again fully Roman Empire, as it always been, because it had just been split, but it had not really changed its nature, its character, right? And it went on for other 8 centuries. That is not really a few. Another last consideration we can make is always to consider the composition of the Roman armies. At the beginning of this period, the Roman army was made up chiefly of Italians, that you can define in this sense geographically, because now even Cisalpine Gaul had been included with the citizenship in the Italic citizenship proper. Actually, it was considered part of it. So there were chiefly Italics and Cisalpine Gauls, but already since Caesar's times, fundamentally many legionaries were not properly from Italy, but sometimes they were from these Roman colonists and their descendants from Gaul or Spain or even Pannonia. So, and many others joined quickly to become eventually the majority. Like in the 2nd century, I think you have this surpassed. By the 3rd century, fairly easily the troops recruited from Italy are just a minority. And especially in the 1st century, it was mostly about Gauls and even partly Syrians, etc. So this naturally corresponded to where the citizenship was extended, through which initially it was because Roman colonists were sent there. So people from Italy proper that went colonizing from Cisalpine Gaul and all the other provinces the Romans expanded in, But at this point, these people started even intermarrying with the local populations. So there were many Roman, of course, emperors that came from all these various provinces. In even in some of the most famous, I mean, in the first, actually in the 2nd century AD, and it was normal. These were sons of naturally of the elite of Rome that had transferred there, but that had set its roots there because it laid its roots there because they had holdings as senators, etc. So they started ruling from there. Still, they could switch at this point, really, even in office, etc. Even some of the authors that were named before are were, I don't know, sent to like Ammianus, who was a governor of Spain before going to Cappadocia, for example. So, you know, was normal and pretty multicultural in this sense. And the most important thing to remember is that even though the official language of the empire was Latin, and every citizen had this kind of Latin name, every legionnaire, every Roman citizen could be from wherever place and could have whatever beliefs. Aside from, of course, they had to accept the imperial religion, let's say, of state, but they could be literally from everywhere as long as they had their ancestors had earned the citizenship, and they were Roman citizens like all others. So just remember that the Roman identity doesn't have anything ethnic attached to it ever, since the very beginning. The very beginning of Rome were a mix between Latins and Sabines, and also parts of some Etruscans, and this was always the deal with Rome, because if Rome had not behaved like that, it would have not expanded. They would have never found the manpower to conquer the world. So this is what made it so unique and made it to conquer that empire, to maintain it, where all the other kind of great empires in Europe, Mediterranean, had failed after some time. At least in recent times, of course. Take Egypt, is still Mediterranean, but you know, talking about, let's say, then this European dimension, but also other empires that had existed shortly before, right? And that's part of the reason why the Romans managed to take over the enemy, like more advanced civilizations that, however, didn't have taken that option as well, so that they had, for instance, the Greeks that were extremely jealous of their citizenship. They didn't extend it to anyone, and they ended up not really without an army, but still with a considerable problem recruiting manpower, and also not just because of the quantity of the people, but also because of their attitude, their lifestyle. They weren't soldiers anymore. Rome had this continuous injection of kind of warlike populations that were struggling to get Roman citizenship and to join the benefits of Roman civilization. And that's how they factually made it to conquer the world. And as we know, then there was this evolution for which the auxiliaries, initially were, we said it before, that they were available within the same imperial from the populations conquered by Rome. Then eventually Rome starts recruiting these troops also from outside the borders, because at one point the Roman citizens, aside from transforming into from warriors from tribal warriors into Roman citizens, at one point also become subjects and peasants and colonists. So they're not warlike anymore, and the Romans need this kind of battle-hardened and troops that were born like warriors that did that for all their lives, and that could be perfected through Roman training, etc. And this is how it happened. And towards the end of this period, also many of the empire's regular troops were recruited from other provinces, and from areas that were actually outside the borders, even like the Huns, that had been partly maybe assimilated. Then there were these populations that initially were outside the borders that entered as walled peoples within the Roman borders. So this is also a very interesting perspective, but for now I believe that it's enough. Long video today, but the topic required it somewhat, and it's I don't know how cool this was. It could go better, let's be honest, but I still think it was fine, and I'm glad I managed to tell this, because as a general perception on the Roman army, I made several videos now on the Roman army, and I always kind of get into this more general topics, and I will probably keep doing that, but this one allowed me to tell the whole general aspect of the story in a kind of a profitable, in a kind of an effective way, but for summarizing the general aspects. And it's obvious that this is extremely superficial as a single video, and that's why I'm making so many others about the Roman army proper in detail and so on. And yeah, so for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.